tropes can also describe something, right? Even though it's like it's tropological through and through. Here's one thing. The whole bit about it, there's this not conversion as conversion, but conversion as repentance, right? Turning back towards God, tawbah, right? Adi Khalil has done a lot of work now on tawbah as a trope in Sufi literature leading up to Al-Ghazali's time. The Ghazali story, compare and contrast, again, lectio difficile, so like, where does he follow certain tropes, where does he seem to divert from those? I've always thought, if he wanted to have a sort of a story where God cures him of his, if he wanted to make up a story where God cures him of his sort of uncertainty, he would have said, I set forth for Mecca, and then on the way to Mecca, God struck me down, right? That sounds like to me like much more like an easy made-up story. Right? But anyhow, so it seems to me as though okay, again, the lectio difficile, or for me would be that when he describes his back and forth, and I was unable to leave, and so on, why would he confess to that unless it was true? That's kind of anyhow. I actually got to say opinions there. My suggestion is that we actually launch directly now into we have a proper sort of text from Ahmed, which everybody has, I'm sure, read on the way here, but I'll simply just so that we sort of don't cheat Ahmed his allotted time. We'll just get on. Please.
Okay, so should I start? Well, a modern historian of Usul al-Fiqh might tell you that Usul al-Fiqh started about 200 years after the immigration, after the beginning of the Muslim calendar, independently by two different people. One being Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, he'd be writing, of course, in Egypt, and the other being Isa ibn Aban, around the same time. The reason Isa ibn Aban, of course, wrote Al-Hujaj al-Saghir and Al-Hujaj al-Kabir. He wrote on Qiyas and Khabar al-Wahid. These books are mostly preserved through Al-Jassas's text. Now, so if there are two Usul al-Fiqh tradition, following the Khaldun here in a way, Ghazali is not going to fit in the Hanafi tradition. Right? When he mentions the Busi, he mentions him with a frowning and a criticism. These are the kinds of people who, when they write about Usul al-Fiqh, they put too much furu'a. They have too many cases and legal scenarios. But in the Risala tradition, Mustasfa is not a commentary on the Risala. Were there commentaries? Yes, at least a century of these, from Sayrafi, who died 330, equaling 942, all the way to Abu Muhammad al-Juwayni, who was the father of Abu al-Ma'ali. And Abu Muhammad al-Juwayni died 436, which is 438, 1046. But if you follow Zarkashi, it's a medieval encyclopedist of Usul Fiqh. Al-Bahr al-Muhit is really a bunch of notes connected together. He has a different history of Usul al-Fiqh, specifically of the Kalam tradition. He says it was two judges that invented this thing. The Qadi Sunnah, meaning Abu Bakr, Muhammad Tayyib al-Baqillani, wa Qadi al-Mu'tazila, Abd al-Jabbar al-Hamadani, or Qadi Abd al-Jabbar. So there is a good reason to think of this as a specific tradition, even though these are, by the way, both of them are Shafi'is, Qadi Abd al-Jabbar and Baqillani. But al-Mustasfa, while it does criticize people who put too much kalam in Usul Fiqh, is an Usul Fiqh text within the Kalam tradition. Mustasfa was destined to be considered one of the four basic texts of Usul al-Fiqh, of which three are known. Again, Abd al-Jabbar, Qadi's text, that's the missing one, either al-Ahd or al-Umud. And the other ones that we have, Abu Hussein al-Basri is Mu'tamad. Hussein is also a Mu'tazili, so now we have two Mu'tazilis or Shafi'is. and 2 Ash'aris who were Shafi'is, and these would be Ghazali and his teacher, Abu al-Ma'ali, Juwayni. So these are the Mustasfa and the Burhan. And I think the reason we have this idea of قواعد هذا العلم أربعة وأركان هذا العلم أربعة is that Razi said that he read them before he wrote Al-Mahsul. Baqillani's text is not a fiction. There is a book called the Taqrib wal-Irshad. The problem is it's not complete. There is one manuscript that was 536 leaves, discovered in India and published as the first half of, by the way, of the short Taqrib. So supposedly there is a Taqrib al-Irshad that's so big, 10 volume or something like that, that nobody has seen. And there's the short one. The short one, if we believe that what was published is half of it, would be 6 volumes. So because the 536 leaves became 1,000 printed pages, 3 volumes that we have. So there maybe is a reason that Razi doesn't mention it. Either didn't read it, or didn't think that it was. Although, of course, if you read the Mustasfa, it's indebted to Taqrib. It borrows comfortably from Baqillani, and it cites him by name too. So Mustasfa fits then in the tradition of Shafi'i Usul al-Fiqh, in which case Risala is somehow relevant, even though the structure of the Risala is very different from any Kalam-based Usul al-Fiqh. And it fits definitely in this Kalam tradition, which would have been just 100 years by the time Ghazali is writing. Now, Usul al-Fiqh is what? Usul al-Fiqh is the sources of the law, right? The foundations of the law, as opposed to the classifications of the actions in practice. When you practice the categorization of human actions in matters of rituals and sales and marriage and so on, you're doing fiqh. You give us details. But now, if you look at Baqillani says usul al-fiqh hiya al-ulum. These are sciences or branches of knowledge that you need to become a good faqih. Which, if you follow Zarkashi or later Shawkani, yes, usul al-fiqh is derived of 3 sciences. It's made of language, lugha, kalam, and fiqh. Usul al-fiqh is made of fiqh. This is going to lead to a lot of people thinking there's something circular there. By fiqh here we mean a few general abstract principles. For example, the classification of actions into 5. That becomes part of usul al-fiqh, but where does it come from? So there are big questions about how old really is usul al-fiqh, and was it really started 200 years after the rise of Islam or not? But there is no question that usul al-fiqh is an amalgam, that it derives from different areas. So Baqillani is not wrong to say that. And Ghazali's main contribution is organization. He says, I'm going to show you how this kind of knowledge can be put under the 4 headings. What are the 4 headings? The classification of actions, the sources of the law, al-adillah or usul al-ahkam, how to derive 1 from 2, how to derive the ahkam from the sources, and the qualifications that pertain to the person who does that, the mujtahid. Now, if you go back to Juwayni, all this information is there, but it's not that organized, and it's not clear that it is 4, it could be 5, or even more. If you go to Shafi'i, he really just talks about the sources. Risala, this is how you get the law, al-kitab, and it's all about interpretation. Then, and he wants to convince you, of course, that Sunnah and Kitab are essentially the same thing. The Prophet has the same power to tell us revelation through his own language, just as he has the power to convey what God says. These are capable of mutual abrogation, etc. Right? So Risala, Shafi'i's Risala, is a very it derives from this sense that it is about the sources in that narrow sense. And of course, when he talks about qiyas, Shafi'i still we're talking qiyas al-qiyas al-ijtihad, and that gets much more complicated by the time Ghazali is writing. Right? So Ghazali's text is important. It's one of 4 basic texts. Whether this was an accident of history or too much trust in Razi or however, that's just survived, that text. And it is actually a good book. So objectively, or if you take my judgment, it's not a bad book in terms of summarizing the field at the time. I wouldn't say the same thing about the other things that I know of Ghazali. I don't think his books are usually good, but this is one good book. Now, as I said, what's in the Mustasfa is this classification. Before the 4 quarters, there's an introduction, and the introduction is about logic. And he says that this is not just the foundation for doing law, this is the foundation for any reasoning. This is the foundation for you to do anything. You have to know what definitions are, you have to do what arguments or burhan, the arguments that stick, the arguments that make sense. Burhan always establishes the correctness of a statement. So there has to be an isnad or a statement, a relationship between 2 things which will be known through had or definition, right? So definition attacks the individual entity or that's expressed by a single word, and the relationship between the 2 is a statement as an assertion, and that leads to other statements being needed through syllogism, for example, or through mostly the most productive thing really, and if you see it in practice, but also it's obvious in the definition, sabr wa taqsim. This is really 80-90% of arguing. Is if you can decide when there is a claim, if this claim belongs to a certain group of possibilities. If you can limit the possibilities to 5 and destroy 4, that's all you need. You don't need to argue for the 5th. It survived. So it's a sabr wa taqsim leading to a reductio ad absurdum, essentially. So what I put here in the paper, and I definitely want your opinion, because I wrote, after I read and I spent my time just remembering the text. That was actually my first text that I read in Usul al-Fiqh in 92, and I read it on my own, so I didn't really understand it until later when I read other texts in the company scholars, and then I went back to it and I started to understand it more. But this time, so I read the whole thing, then I wrote very quickly, because I didn't also want to tailor stuff. I just wanted to see what comes out. But there is no necessity as far as what information I can put there. I can put other examples. So I really want your impression. You don't have to tell me now, shoot me an email and say, well, yeah. So for example, is this really engaging? Is this boring? Does it seem to cover the whole field for you if you're broadly interested in it? But now, in the next 10-15 minutes, I'll still summarize that without reading much from the paper. The first issue of where the law comes from that has to be settled, it doesn't come from reason only, right? Reason is not sufficiently productive of the laws. You'll see very quickly that is important. But by itself, what does it mean to say that reason by itself produces law? That means that you're a Mu'tazili. That means that you think that we can recognize the goodness or the badness of action as intrinsic to action. So his first argument has to be against the Mu'tazilis. That comes in quarter 1. In the first quarter, when he talks about ahkam, it really kind of doesn't belong, but he forces it there because it's so important, so introductory. But the Mu'tazila hold that human actions are good or bad. This goodness or badness is known by the human reason without the mediation of any reflection, such as the goodness of saving a drowning person and those on the verge of perishing, and such as being grateful to the one who bestows all of life's gifts. That's a basic theological question. Wujub shukr al-mun'im aqlan. So without knowing whether this mun'im is one or multiple or whatever, but just if you know that somebody gave you gifts, the gifts that exist in this world, can you ala ibn Tufayl, ala Hayy ibn Aqdan, just know that you have to be thankful. Of course, you'd puzzle how to do that. But anyway, so and such as being grateful to the one who bestows all of life's gifts, and such as the goodness of truthfulness, and such as the badness of denial of the gifts, that is kufran, that would be the opposite of what Hayy ibn Aqdan should come to do. Inflicting pain on the innocent, all examples of badness, right? That's intrinsic and doesn't take much to think, right? You don't need revelation for these things to know. And lying with no justification, right? Some of these are known via reason after some reflection, such as the goodness of truthfulness, from which harm ensues. That needs reflection, so it doesn't need revelation. So you're going to be truthful, and that would cause some harm, but you'd still do it. It's good to do that, even though leads to some problems, and the badness of lying, from which benefits ensue. Some of these are known via revelation. Now we reach the revelation, such as the goodness of prayers, pilgrimage, and the rest of the rituals. These acts they claimed, so he's trying to be reasonable here. Mu'tazilis are very sophisticated about this, but they're still wrong. These acts they claim possess a quality that distinguishes them from other acts, as those acts promote the potential of the softness of the heart, which creates a propensity toward being good deeds and doing good deeds, and refraining from bad ones. But the human reason could not discern this on its own. But this Mu'tazili position is compromised because they don't realize something very basic. If you know that something is good or bad, assuming that that's possible, he refutes that too, because he has three meanings of hasan and qabih, which begs the question of which one are you going to pick. But even if you can decide what is hasan or qabih in a specific situation, the big thing is, and he learned that from Juwayni, you can know what to do about it, but you cannot know how God will reward you. Okay? So the big distinction on the husn al-qubh between Ash'aris and Mu'tazilis, that's explicitly stated in Subki and other texts later, but it actually comes close to being explicit in Juwayni. That, it doesn't matter that you can tell me, I can figure out what's good or bad. How can you guess reward or punishment? You need the Prophet for that. And there is no sense really to knowing the goodness or badness of things unless you know what to do with them and what to expect after doing that. But let's stay with him a little bit. So aql by itself is not productive of the laws. But does it produce anything? By itself still, before it's acting on revelation? Yes, surprisingly. It is the fourth of four sources that are not imaginary. The four real sources of the law. He'll tell us later about the three, but the fourth is, aql is productive in that it negates the existence of an obligation in the absence of revelation. So when you don't know what to do with this drink it or not drink it, there's only one of two possibilities, doing or not doing. Now, if it is a matter of permission, it's trivial. But if the question is, if I have an obligation, how would I know that there is an obligation to drink this drink? I need a revelation for that. So to establish a positive obligation, you need revelation. But to establish the absence of obligation, you don't need more than reason. So reason is a source. Dalil al-aql wal-istishab. It's not qiyas. Okay, the fourth source is not qiyas. Dalil al-aql wal-istishab is the ability to say there is no sixth prayer in the day. There is no fasting in Shawwal. So the unaided human reason is incapable of establishing any obligation. Negating an obligation, however, is within the reach of that unaided reason until a revelation-based source with an indication that moves that act from the original negation. The unaided reason is thus capable of establishing one of the two possibilities. That is to say, negating a responsibility, but not establishing it. Okay? So reason by itself doesn't make laws, but can establish the negation of an obligation. And then, even that last one, of course, he has to attend to an argument. When people say, well, maybe reason is not a source at all. If all it does is establishes ignorance, essentially. So if people tell you all you're saying that the human reason unaided by revelation is capable of doing is that it is capable of ignorance. And ignorance is not knowledge. He says, well, if it were argued that all this unaided reason's knowledge is ignorance of the presence of a revelation, we would reply that an absence of a revelation-based knowledge may be attained with certainty or ilm, or very similar to Ghazali. We are, for example, certain that there is no argument for the obligation of fasting during the month of Shawwal, nor is there one to establish the obligatoriness of a sixth daily prayer. Were there to be such an argument, it would have been transmitted. It wouldn't have been obscured from the worldwide community of Muslims. This here is knowledge. Okay, this is not ignorance. This here is knowledge of an absence of an argument or a foundation for an instruction, rather than absence of knowledge of a foundation. Yes, absence of knowledge of the foundations of an instruction is not a binding argument, it's not a hujjah, it's not an argument. But this one is knowledge of the absence of a compelling argument, and that one is binding. Okay, we can revisit that if this is just too, much of a mind-bending thing. So what are the sources before this aql? 3 in 1. And at one point he says the 3 are one, but the one being God's word. Because all the Prophet does is he conveys it. And that shows his Shafi'i leaning, that he thinks of the Sunnah and the Kitab are basically two sides of the same coin. Ijma' is only an agreement on how to understand that God's word. But that's one time, so he makes the 3 into 1 being God's word, and page 6 or something like that in the first quarter, and then by page 100 it's 3 in 1 and the 3 being the Prophet's word. Because essentially the Prophet conveys God's word, right? We haven't met God. We didn't meet the Prophet, but we're as good as having met the Prophet. We'll talk about reporting later on. But we met the Prophet told us this is God's word and this is my word, which is the same as God's word, and consensus is an agreement on what the Prophet essentially taught. But either way, it's 3 in 1. So this ijma' is mysterious though. Let me shift to this ijma', because of course, in subsequent texts of Usul al-Fiqh, there are 2 ijma'as, and we have to decide which one is the meaningful one, the agreement of all Muslims or the agreement of the scholars. Zarkashi is very explicit. There is no value to the lay people's agreement. They could agree and they could be wrong. But when the scholars agree, that's meaningful. But actually, if you trace Usul al-Fiqh texts backward, you see that the difference between Ittifaq al-Ummah and Ittifaq al-Mujtahideen thins out, of course, in the early centuries, which makes sense. And Ghazali's text is also one weak point, anyway, that he essentially makes that ijma' to argue for its value. He makes it nothing but I say here, essentially a meek, almost simple empirical reality. When Muslims agree to do something, how can they be wrong? They are right in saying that Muslims do X. When Zoroastrians agree on something, and they say that that's what Zoroastrians do, they're right in reporting what they report, right? They're wrong, of course, because they're Zoroastrians. But they're right in reporting the content of their belief. So of course all Muslims will say that there are only 5 prayers. That's a good example of a consensus. But it becomes really just much less. So this is something also that happens a lot in Usul al-Fiqh. The higher the standard for establishing something, then the less productive it becomes. It just becomes less interesting, what you can establish with no disagreement. But he has interlocutors, believe it or not. There are people who argued against Ijma' Nazam, said there's no such a thing. How could the agreement of people be indicative of anything? Mm-hmm. Right. Let me give you a modern example. 60 million Americans voted for this current president. Did they have the same reason? Of course not. So their agreement is absolutely coincidental. Right? It doesn't tell us anything. The conclusion is there, yeah. It's very deceiving to think of people's agreement as meaningful. And it's actually one reason Zarkashi and others think that the agreement has to be the agreement of scholars, because they are the ones who agree with reasons. But non-scholars are reasonable people too, except that they have different reasons. Right? So, where was I going with this? Nazam has this idea that for an argument to make any sense, it has to have reasons. So if there is any sense in which ijma' is reasonable or is important, it's because one person made an argument and nobody was able to defeat it. So think of the election of Abu Bakr. That's a good example of a consensus. How did they agree? Sa'd ibn Ubadah was the better candidate at some point, right? But there was an argument that everybody accepted. Juwayni has a lot of fun describing how this consensus can arise from disagreement, right? Consensus arises from disagreement. And the disagreement may have resulted from an almost early consensus, like they were about to say Sa'd. And then somebody made an argument and it shifted. And it is that moment when a majority started to say, yeah, Abu Bakr. That's the beginning of a moment where you should be, of course, as a political matter, you should have gone with the majority then, but once they all agreed, that becomes important. Of course, there is no real consensus in the case of Abu Bakr, because there are people who are absent. But this is another Usul Fiqh discussion too. Can you call a case of consensus if there is only 1 or 2 people who disagree, or if there is absence? And then the other extreme is, can you say that ijma' existed even though it was only 1 person who held that opinion, but nobody disagreed. It's called ijma' sukuti, right? A consensus from silence. Well, in any case, so his ijma' theory is, it makes sense for him to say that the three sources are one. The three sources at the end, it's a little bit of a sleight of hand, but the sources are essentially the Quran and the Sunnah, which are one, and the ijma' is not going to do much, which of course is not the case for somebody like Abu al-Husayn al-Basri. Abu al-Husayn al-Basri is very explicit that ijma' can arise from ijtihad. When all the jurists agree, with or without a text, on something that's binding to us, because they didn't agree for no good reason. And why would you reinvent the wheel? Or in fact, for Basri, is essentially how the law could proceed without some consensus. We can't keep arguing about everything all the time. Yeah, anyway, I can talk about consensus forever. There are all kinds of interesting things. In modern times, in the 19th century, there was an Ibadi scholar who said, what if all scholars agree that coffee is prohibited? Would that be a consensus or just a coincidence of agreement? And he said it would be a coincidence of agreement. You know why? Because he thinks ijma' has to have a foundation. Right? This is just, they all don't like coffee or decide that maybe for political reasons it's bad to avoid it, which is different from saying we will interpret the Prophet's trips that are short or long, a certain length to be indicative of when you can shorten the prayer or when you can combine. Right? So for some people, ijma' is still tied to the text. And for some people, it just is the agreement, which is valuable anyway, even if you can't tie it to a text. And for others, it's just the agreement of all Muslims. And how can you argue against that? If all Muslims think that that there are only 5-time prayers, you can't, as an outsider, just decide that they're all wrong. Now let's get to the Shafi'i side, because the law is not Sunni or Islamic or anything like that. It's more specific. The law is Shafi'i, and most of his usul al-fiqh, to the extent that I would stop my reading and go back and check, he's always involved in refuting other positions, like Hanafi positions or Maliki positions, in the choices he makes. For example, commands, in principle, do commands indicate that you do the act once in a lifetime? Do they demand repetition in principle? Now, of course, in circumstances you solve these problems, but what is the default? Is the default of a command is that it indicates repetition, that the act should be done multiple times, should be done immediately, or should be done within a window, should be done, what else? Yeah, multiple times, or immediately, or does it even establish an obligation to begin with? Because a command could establish something else, right? Less than these are the three examples, and these discussions get to be thicker and bulkier and later usul al-fiqh texts. But he has the basic idea, and his choices are really very easy ways to just defend Shafi'i doctrines. At the end, whenever he thinks that there are bad arguments, he has examples from Hanafi and Maliki law. People who think that the subject of usury are these 6 articles, that are 4 of them are food and 2 of them are currency. It's gold, silver, and then wheat, dates, etc. Oh, they just don't notice. This is talazum. This is just, it so happened that these 6 were food and were usurious or subjects of usury. But there's another reason that's not about the fact that they are food. That's that. Or about the fact that they're measurable, right? So he's acting against the Hanafi doctrine that they're measurable. So at the end of the day, it's not a very clean exercise. The choices within usul al-fiqh possibilities. It's a very Shafi'i exercise. I think the conclusion is in his head before he makes the argument. Why would you not do that? The one thing that concerns philosophers is this consistent idea of the 2 worlds. The religious law exists or applies here, but there is another world, right? The world of the ihya and the world of the reality, that is not completely divorced from this world, but it's really not it. So a good example, actually this is also plagiarized from Baqillani, but it's a very important example. What is the law of God when I marry my sister, not knowing that she's my sister? I did my best. I exhausted all the tests. And the woman I married, I thought was not my sister. Is God's law that this is not marriage? And the answer is no. God's law is that this is marriage. Okay, this is really God's ruling here, because I did my best. I'm not a God. I'm a human being. So I could get it wrong. There is nothing wrong about doing exactly the wrong thing because of ignorance. That's the right thing. And it's not only that it's in the world of the appearances and this bad world that's changing constantly, but there is a reality here. Now Shafi'is have a distinction between hukm al-qada and hukm al-diyana, meaning there is something that the judge could get and get wrong. So if the judge decides that a certain woman is married to a certain man based on the testimony of two people who are actually grave sinners and therefore or liars, that marriage is not real. But you know why? Because we could discover it in this world. So if these two witnesses come after the ruling and tell the judge we lied, that should be negated. That ruling should be negated. Not for Hanafis. Hanafis say no, the ruling was right at the time, it doesn't get negated. In fact, the Hanafis actually have a very clever argument. They say, when these two people gave their testimony based on our best knowledge at the time of the testimony, they were shown to be truthful, or presumptively truthful. Therefore, that ruling was correct. When they told us that they were liars after the ruling, that makes them fusaq. So what they said after the ruling doesn't work. They're adamant that the judge rules based on that incomplete evidence, and that becomes final. But the Shafi'is think, there is a distinction between hukm al-qada and hukm al-diyana. That is, the Shafi'i woman, for example, not believing that the ruling of the judge is correct, gets to escape and not be accessible sexually to her husband. Okay? But now, move with me just one step further. Because what if we don't have this knowledge forever? We're going to live and die not knowing that these two people were liars. That's God's law. So I could be married to my sister. And that would be marriage in the eyes of God, because there's no way for us to know now. When we know then, and God's law, it won't be called God's law then, it will be something else. I mentioned Juwayni, Ghazali, and Mazari, and the reason is, and I avoid Ibn Rushd, just because he's my friend, so I can't bring him up in this discussion. But there is a clear bias in Abu Abdullah al-Mazari for Ghazali and against Juwayni in that same exercise. That's usul al-fiqh. Why? Because Juwayni's Burhan has many moments where he's willing to say that religious knowledge is not certain. How do we know this tawatur thing? Okay. Also, Juwayni has a topology of knowledge and what is possible, what is certain, right? What you cannot deny. And the things that, it's possible that when everybody ran out of this building and they said there was fire, that they were all motivated by one idiot who said there was fire. And that's tawatur. They are all telling you there was fire inside, and in fact there is no fire. They just got it from one person. So Juwayni's careful. I mean, he never tells you a lot of the sunnah is really just rubbish. He doesn't say that. But he comes closer to favoring the ways of a physicist. Right? That's how Mazari understands it. And of course, when you go back to Al-Burhan, he's not unreasonable. There are moments of doubt in Juwayni. Ghazali doesn't have that. So I have this paragraph to stimulate the discussion. Ghazali was a student of Juwayni. His Mustasfa was a clear debt to Juwayni's Burhan. Why would a reader of Juwayni's Burhan find it deserving of blame, undeserved by Ghazali in his Mustasfa? In Idah al-Mahsul, من علم الأصول, which is Mazari's text, which by the way, Sizkine believed was missing and Brooklyn believed was missing, and it ended up showing up from one of the libraries of Nashur's library, and it was published now by Dar al-Gharb al-Islam. It's not complete though, it's missing a little bit, but Mazari sees the student and the follower, Ghazali, to have succeeded where the teacher, Juwayni, failed. The difference comes down to how each one of them considered the nature of religious knowledge. Juwayni found much fault with the arguments of Muslim theologians or mutakallimun, which arguments seem to benefit non-Muslim philosophers. So really, it's these moments, and if you look for them, you find them. You notice that Juwayni has no problem leaving you with the impression that, that's what we do, but we're not really sure, or that there is a way for observation and the physicists and the metaphysicians to give us more information. And actually, Mazari has a hunch, I think he's right about this, that if Juwayni were to live longer, he would have done more philosophy and may have changed a lot of his views too. So Juwayni comes close to being a philosopher, at least a political philosopher in my view, which is something I don't see Ghazali as being able to do. Because, the philosopher has to have the risk of believing nothing at all, or believing something other than what he started with. And I don't get the sense that Ghazali is ready for that, was able to do that. Okay, if that's enough provocation. The point of Qiyas al-Ghaib al-Shahid, it's these two worlds, right? There is really, I can't find that law that allows Ghazali to do it sometimes and not do it sometimes. And Mazari is more succinct in saying that you shouldn't do it unless there is a reason. And بغير سبب جامع. But this sabab jama in his application, it begins and ends with a commitment to the religion. Why? Because physics and metaphysics are not conclusive. That's not explicit in Ghazali. Maybe I can't, it's explicit somewhere and I'm ignorant of it. But one thing that makes Abu Adl al-Mazari much more capable of making the case, he says basically, look, we can ask what the physicists do. When they keep making observations and they say here's a cause and here's an effect, at the end of the day, they hit a wall because nature has things that just happen, magnets. They say when they can't explain it, they say it's khassiyya. It's like that. And that's a very powerful argument, actually very powerful in my mind in modern times too. Okay, so when people say, well, the Big Bang is the best interpretation of the world, well, do you know this is just one corner of the world or the whole thing? No, we don't. Are you sure about the red colors and the blue colors that this light is coming towards us or however? Well, it's, it's what we know, it's what we think. A lot of physics and a lot of astronomy and everything basically other than mathematics is inconclusive. So this is something that some people notice. If Ghazali noticed that and he knows that, and that's why he begins and ends with the religion, that would be a reasonable position because that means that he knows that philosophy is not productive. As I say, when he talks about the subject of the sciences in the beginning of the text, the divisions of the ulum, the general knowledge for him is kalam. So this is just as close to saying that physics and metaphysics don't lead to anything. We know that. So maybe other thoughts will come to me with the questions. Sure.
Thank you very much. Very much enjoyed your reflections and provocations. I'd love to hear your thoughts on a few things. Ghazali's attachment to the madhab is a bit out of pattern with a lot of his own predecessors on the Sufiya. Abu Talib al-Makki, Abu al-Hakam al-Marajan, who's our predecessor, Muhyiddin al-Arabi. They all have quite a tenuous relationship with the madhab. Sort of a non-denominationalist streak in them, which I don't sense in the Mustasfa. Which leads me to make the statement that Sufis and Usulis are often going hand in hand. It's been recognized for quite a long time in Andalus and the Maghrib that many of the Sufis were Usulis at the very highest level in Andalus, and the Maghrib Cornell talks about this in his book. I do as well. And the text of Mustasfa, being at the final phase of his life, I would have placed it if nobody told me that it's that, and I'm assuming that he's writing after the Shkaz. I would have thought it would be sort of earlier in his life.
So let me ask you a question.
The arc of his work.
Now, do you think that Makki and others studied enough fiqh? I mean, the way Ghazali did. Because Ghazali clearly knows Shafi'i law.
Yeah.
There are 4 books attributed to him. I don't know the big and the small one. I don't know Khulas, I don't know Basit. But we know Al-Wajiz and we know Al-Wasit. And Al-Wajiz attracted a commentary by Rafi'i, the Qazwini scholar. And Nawawi talks a lot about Wasit, the Ghazali's long text. I mean, it's not that long, but it was published in 7 volumes because it got flushed out. So,
Name one, for instance, Abu Hassan Shushtari, taught the Mustasfa and gave ijaza in it. And he's Ibn Sarhain's disciple, he's as wild a Sufi as it gets. And his attachment to the madhab is very difficult to say.
no, I asked you, so do they study fiqh? I mean, do they study it so quickly and generally? Because the commitment to the madhab in my head comes from knowing it. I don't have attachments. Closest would be an attachment or interest in Hanafi law, but I don't know any of these madhabs very well. So that's the reason for my lack of attachment.
Maybe no, because they often say, look, just focus on the essentials and get on with what's really important.
Right.
So
It's priorities. Yeah.
it may be fair to say that they're not invested in the juridical system and in becoming full judges, but some of them actually are offered judgeships and so on, and they tend to turn them down. So maybe they're not as trained.
Ayman has.
No, sorry. Before Ghazali, there were many Sufis who were also committed to madhab. Madhab. Qushairi, for instance, is a good
That's right,
example. He's
he's well
Harawi is Hanbali, is Sunj Hanbali. So before Ghazali, there were many examples.
And being a member of a madhab in Khorasan at the time also meant being a member of a faction.
Yeah.
And Bullet writes about the destruction of Nishapur, your destruction of Nishapur, the hands as sort of battles between Hanafis and Shafi'is. So it would have been a different connotation for Ghazali.
I mean, there is a reason, of course, Yusuf is right, that there is a good reason, even if you know the madhab very well, if you begin to forget it and become a real Sufi for, say, 20 years or something like that, that the attachment to the madhab weakens, and then you realize other madhabs have insights and will give people the benefit of the doubt. And it's not just a lack of understanding of the madhab, but realizing that it is not everything, and that you can find other insights outside, even in Shi'i law. I mean, why not? It doesn't even have to be Sunni. But so Ghazali is a puzzle in this. We talked about this, the division of labor that really doesn't allow one area of epistemology to penetrate into the other one, because Al-Wajiz and Al-Wasit are technical works, and they were appreciated enough, even though now he's very harsh, by the way, on Ghazali in his decisions in Al-Wasit. Not because he doesn't know the madhab, but because he follows Juwayni, and Juwayni makes mistakes. Juwayni's mistakes are based on the fact that he's free. Okay, so Juwayni had this pretension that he was a Shafi'i accidentally. He said, مَا قَلَّدْنَا الشَّافِعِيَّةِ وَلَكِنْ وَافَقَ رَأْيُنَا رَأْيَهُ. And I'll prove it to you. I'll disagree with him in a few things. And he actually does that in Nihayat al-Matlab. But it's not that he really didn't care to report Shafi'i's view. He was making his own argument sometimes for the school, which for Nawawi, who was interested only in establishing what Shafi'i said, deviated from Shafi'i's reasoning and in fact got it wrong quite a bit at the time. So when Ghazali follows Juwayni, according to Nawawi, he gets it wrong. And he's better when he follows another guy named Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, who's also a reporter of the madhab. He wrote al-Muhadhab, and he's more disciplined. These people, Shafi'i law is also just another story, because, when Shafi'i died, they had maybe 10,000, 15,000 cases and legal scenarios. How did these become 100,000 by the end of the 4th century, 4th, 10th century? Ashab al-Wujuh. They made up cases, and they began to imagine Shafi'i answering the questions. Sometimes they disagreed. So then there were wujuh that got contradictory, and these had to be sifted through. But if the task of the madhab is to guess what Shafi'i would have done had he continued to live 1,000 years, then you would go Nawawi's way. And that's why later followers of Shafi'i law say that we have essentially two people, like this guy from Qazwin Rafi'i who settles in Syria, and Nawawi from Syria originally, and the two of them, if they agreed, that's Shafi'i law. And if they disagreed, they took Nawawi. So Shafi'i law essentially after Nawawi becomes Nawawi's law, right? Whatever Nawawi believes.
Yes, and Steve.
Yes. Thanks, Ahmed, for a very clearly articulated presentation. My question pertains to the time when Imam Ghazali wrote the Al-Mustasfa. Was he a fully fledged Ash'ari? Because when he wrote the Mizan al-Amal in the year 1095, in the Mizan al-Amal, when it comes to good and evil, right and wrong action, he makes a distinction between the universals and the particulars. And he says that for the universals of good and evil, you can determine that by the aql, by the intellect, independent of revelation. So for example, you do not need revelation to tell you that it's wrong to lie, or that it's wrong to murder, or that it is good to be humble. These are universal ethics, universal virtues. You can determine that by your intellect, but when it comes to particulars, like how do we know whether it is prohibited to drink wine or pork? We cannot know that through the intellect. We have to depend on divine revelation, and that doesn't sound to me like a conventional Ash'ari perspective. So I'd like
You say that he says that we can't, through medicine, for example, decide not to eat pork, or through the study of human situations to avoid wine. Why? Why would that be the case?
He says we can determine that only through the revealed law. But when it comes to the universals of right and wrong, then the intellect, independent of revelation, can determine that for us. So I don't know if that distinction is made in the Mustasfa. I'm not sure.
So yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and maybe I shouldn't hazard an attempt to an accurate answer, but I think he is an Ash'ari. He surprises me with things that are really, really unreasonable for a jurist to think, but they're consistent theologically. For example, can God ask you to do something, and before you even get a chance to do it, He abrogates it? Okay, you don't have time to even comprehend and probably reasonably do it at least once. I ask you to, if you're allowed to drink wine, because that was one law that was available, you are allowed to do it, but just at night. Wouldn't it make sense to at least for you to get a week or so to do this, and then I say no more wine? So why is he dealing with this? Abraham is asked to slaughter his son, and he doesn't even get a chance to do it, and it gets abrogated. So this very awkward story becomes a foundation for his legal reasoning or legal epistemological reasoning. And he says, of course that could happen. And you know why? Because that relativity of time that you're worried about is not important. Time, law, language, and the physical world are all according to God. If God were to change nature completely between the time He gave you the first rule, like He said, slaughter an animal, and then made all animals extinct before you arrive at any one of them, would that be unreasonable? No, God could do that. This is just very Ash'ari and very strange, right? I mean, there's no legal reasoning that really benefits from that kind of thing. So I can think of examples like these, the examples of the analogies, the qiyas al-ghaib al-shahid. I thought of another one in the break. The king, it's one disanalogy between the human king and God. Can a king ask you to tell you that something is prohibited, but lets you do it with no immediate punishment at all? So a modern government tells you can't drive at 95. It has to be 75 or 70. And then you keep driving 95 and He lets you do it, and there's no immediate punishment. But this is what God does all the time. He says, don't drink wine, and all of you here are drinking wine. And it's fine. He's letting you live. He didn't punish you at all. So the human king is not analogous to God. You see what I'm saying? And he's obsessed with these things when obviously they don't make any point. Yeah, you know the difference between a human king and God is that God has infinite time. He's not going to punish you now, but he's going to punish you later if you believe in that. Which maybe my point is not clear, but the analogies or disanalogies between al-ghaib ala al-shahid are really just done are done based on convenience. There's nothing consistent there.
Yeah. No, I think that this is important to highlight because Yasin's concern would be shared by many around the table, myself included, who would like to think that so Ghazali post-1095 becomes an ethical naturalist, or in sort of a roughly Aristotelian way, or something like that, and that he starts thinking that those are also God's ways. So I think that actually leaving the evidence just to stand, not try to harmonize, say this is the Ghazali of the Mustasfa. This is a clearly articulated worldview. The fact that it doesn't seem to jive with sort of what I would, for instance, like to see Ghazali to be saying around 1109, that it's all the better if it's right there as clear as can be. So the sort of examples that you produce are really useful, I think, exactly just as a challenge. Because again, I for one am not interested in forced harmonization. I'd rather see the oddities there if they are there. Stephen and then Emma.
I think you might try to make some harmony, but within the bounds of a tradition or whatever. I think this example comes from an analogy with medicine, and it actually ties in with the ethical epistemology of prophecy when you say that, for instance, you distinguish between the particular and the universal. So a medic who knows the science of hot and cold and health and body and the humors can have the general rules for medicine, but they don't know the particular properties of a given herb. So, and that, I think, goes back, I think the analogy is actually made in Sa'adat and Nishatain of Isfahan again, and so Ghazali seems to pick it up from there. But I had two questions. That was the remark was okay. So to our speaker, so how are the changes that he does make, perhaps to Usul, reflective of his revival project? I've found myself speaking about it as a reality, but do you see, and that's a question from outside of Usul Fiqh into Usul Fiqh, but can you?
Well, I mean, yeah, so I think I might not be able to have the most accurate expression, but I think learning from you yesterday and today, it's dawning on me that there are things actually in the Mustasfa that needed to be explained by what you were talking about, and what you were, in particular, Steve, talking about last night, but everybody, how, this cheating or arguing from conclusions that strike the reader, or strike the reader of the Mustasfa, have to do with things that he's settled somewhere else. So he's comfortable just starting from conclusions. I mean, of course, he was writing this, 16 months before he died, so he has the right to begin from his conclusions, because these are the conclusions of 50 years or 53 years of thinking.
Does it affect his view of prophecy, for instance? Seeing the Hadith and the Quran as being identical, they're malakuti meanings cast into similitudes.
That's right, yeah, so actually I thought about this, of course, when Paul was talking yesterday. You should definitely see what he talks about as Sunnah, because he gets into how this knowledge is attained at all, and then how it's conveyed. It's consistent with the sense that the Prophet Muhammad is a different person, that he has access, but there are hints that maybe other people can come close to knowing that sort of thing. So yeah, it's consistent, but you see that Hayat has a lot of details. And just to convey to you what's going on in the Mustasfa, there is law and there is kalam. And this text is in the middle, or mediates the two. So it's not, the personal there, the Ghazali individual who, occasionally, he talks about himself, but it's not important. What's important is the argument. the argument that at the end he's right, and he's going to show you that he's right using the familiar tools of usul al-fiqh. But that in a way is why I say it's kind of a good book, because it's not easy to do that. It's not easy to be consistent like this. He's obsessive about divisions. Every time he's writing, it's clear that these materials existed in his head. I mean, when you enter a lecture and you say, I'm going to have 7 points, that means you know the 7th before you start the first. And that's what he does all the time. There are a few anomalies, but these could be the manuscript, or could be him also thinking, using fen as opposed to khutbah, or occasionally. But the big divisions are there. It's beautiful, the way the structure goes down. So this is well contemplated, which also is one reason I was talking to somebody the other day about when you date the text, it's easy to date the introduction. There's no question that the introduction to the Mustasfa was written after Al-Mankhul and after, which are his other texts on Usul Fiqh, after Al-Mankhul and after Ishfa al-Ghali. These are 2 texts in Usul Fiqh. But does that transfer to the next chapter? No, maybe he had a draft of this for years. It's just the text is so mature though, so I think it took a while, and he got good at it. Later in Futur al-Sharia and the questions of Ijtihad, he's not that good. And actually, there's a really strange moment where he summarizes what Juwayni says and copies it and says, that's what Juwayni says, I'm not sure I understand it. It's a very strange moment at the end.
Okay, last question goes to Ayman.
Yeah, going back to the question on ethics, there is a big difference between the Mizan, what Al-Ghazali says in the Mizan, and what he says in his works on Usul Fiqh. Simply because the former is on ethics of virtue, whereas the latter is on the law, it's normative ethics, ethics of action. So in his works on Usul Fiqh, he's interested in rulings, in what is obligatory, so in taklif and wujud, what's obligatory on everyone, all Muslims. Whereas in his ethics of virtue, these are not obligations. It's not an obligation on each individual to develop his or her character. So, and earlier Ash'aris would more or less have the same attitude. They would be, would take the same position in the context of Kalam and Usul Fiqh, but they would be, quite open to a more, let's say, they would be more flexible when it comes to virtue, and although they don't do it in the same way as Ghazali does. So I've written quite a bit on this, and there is a big difference in this. But when I wanted to make a comment on Al-Juwayni. So what Al-Juwayni does, especially in the Burhan, is that he and I've already discussed aspects of this in an article on the argument from ignorance. Is what Al-Juwayni does in the Burhan is that he casts doubt on the epistemology, the standard epistemology of classical kalam and of usul fiqh in that period. But he doesn't replace it with anything. So he just raises doubts and says, well, this doesn't really work. There's a problem here, a problem there. And he doesn't really provide adequate solutions. And what Al-Ghazali does is he just replaces everything with Aristotelian logic. And curious thing is that he doesn't really comment on earlier kalam or
replaces everything. You mean in the introduction? In the introduction to before the 4 quarters? Or you mean inside the Mustasfa?
Yeah. So he has a discussion of logic there.
That's right. Yeah, that's Aristotelian to the extent that he understands it. There are problems
he
there. He
does the same in very briefly in the Iqtisad. And it's curious that he doesn't really comment on Juwayni or the problems that he raises, whereas a few decades later Al-Razi does the same. Well, not the same. He defends Aristotelian logic, but tells us about all the problems in classical kalam epistemology. So it's curious that Al-Ghazali doesn't really comment on that at all.
Right. No, I mean, I should add this and credit you, because it's true that there's no real difference between Juwayni and Ghazali from the 2 texts. Mazari is willing to praise Juwayni but not because he provides an alternative. So Ayman is absolutely right. There is no real alternative. When you say Ghazali has an alternative, which is Aristotelianism, that has to do with the awkward structure of Mustasfa, the fact that it has this long introduction. Although in the beginning, though, he says, this is an introduction, it's not an introduction to usul al-fiqh, it's an introduction to thinking in general, and if you don't want to write it, don't write it. So it's clearly he's dictating, right, to students, so or reading it to somebody. So the introduction, the I, in my division, there's an I, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. Q1 is ahkam, Q2 is al-adillah, Q3 is al-istithmar, al-istinbat, how you get one from two, and then al-ijtihad, or hal al-mustathmir, hal al-mustafid. The I is an introduction to logic, which is about hadd and burhan. So this is, yeah, you're right, it's completely Aristotelian.
Thank you very much, and thank you also to Ken.